Good afternoon, everybody. Neal Conlon here with AppGuard. We'll be kicking off our webinar here in just a few moments. I'd like to give people a few extra minutes to get seated and to dial in. We'll be muted here in the New York office and circle back and kick this off in just a couple minutes. Good afternoon once again, everybody. It is 12:02 in New York City, and so we'll kick off this webinar. I'm sure a few more folks will join as we continue on this conversation. A special thank you to the more than 200 folks who have joined this call. I'm sure we're going to get a lot more than that here in the next couple of minutes. We had a significant amount of people sign up for this call, almost double of the amount that have logged in the first 2 minutes, so I appreciate that. The purpose of this panel discussion was in lieu of recent events between the U.S. and Iran. We had several of our major customers at AppGuard reach out to us and ask us for guidances and best practices. We then in turn reached out to some of the advisors that we work with, and since AppGuard's mission statement is to continue to be a global leader in preventative cyber solutions, we wanted to bring this panel discussion together, and we were able to mobilize this conversation very quickly. Just to add in a few comments that have come up in the last couple of days across various news wires, the U.S. government and state and local agencies are evaluating Iran's capabilities to launch retaliatory cyber attacks, and even though the U.S. government is prepared for acts of cyber war, there's great concern that enterprise companies, critical infrastructure at state and local levels, and smaller SMB market companies may or may not be prepared for such cyber attacks. In 2018, just to throw some data points out, the U.S. cyber attacks cost the U.S. $109 billion just that 1 year alone. And in a recent note that came out from the Infrastructure Security Agency of DHS on January 6th, there's a warning to have all companies in the U.S. to assess and strengthen their basic cyber and physical defenses against potential threats such as disruptive cyber attacks, cyber-enabled spying, IP theft, as well as physical attacks against American citizens and their global interests. So for anybody on this webinar discussion who has direct questions, please do feel free to send them in to us. At the end of the conversation, we will do our best to answer those questions, and if they're require a little bit more research on our end, we'll make sure to dig into the weeds a little bit and come back to everyone with the answer to those questions. Also, we are putting together a formal document of best practices, which will be in the follow-up email for all the folks who have registered for this event afterwards, and we'll update that based on this conversation and get it out to everybody. Now, I'm very happy and very glad that AppGuard continues to be able to bring such world-renowned advisors on counterintelligence and national security. So I'd like to welcome and go through the biographies a little bit of our esteemed speakers. Mark Kelton is a retired senior Central Intelligence Agency executive with 34 years of experience in intelligence operations. Mr. Kelton's career included more than 16 years of overseas service and includes 4 key assignments in CIA leadership positions. He concluded his career as Deputy Director of Counterintelligence, one of the most senior ranking positions in the clandestine service. Directing the CIA's counterintelligence and counter-espionage programs, Mark led the team and protected the nation's most closely guarded secrets, and Mark has comprehensive expertise in intelligence operations, international security issues, detection of insider threats, assessment of counterintelligence risk, and crisis management. John Mullen serves as the Senior VP for National Security at AppGuard, where he drives lead generation and strategic enterprise clients, both here in the U.S. and abroad. He started his post-government career as Chief Operating Officer at Redacted, a thriving cybersecurity startup in California. John also serves as a Board of Managers member and security advisor to Sandia National Laboratories, where he guides efforts to maximize efficiency and build collaborative teams to protect the largest nuclear weapons and strategic technology complex from a host of threats. Before coming to the private sector, John worked at the CIA, where he most recently served as Assistant Director. John has led U.S. clandestine collection, technical support, analytic efforts in the East Asia and Pacific region, and advised the White House, NSC, and senior policymakers on cyber, counterintelligence, and other national security issues. It's a lot of words, but we have very, very compelling, experienced people on this call, and I want to make it very clear of where the background of these individuals and where their knowledge base is coming from. We also have AppGuard CEO, John Loew. John has a 25-year track record in technology and security and where those industries collide. John is joined as the CEO of AppGuard in 2017. We also have Chuck Brooks on the phone as well. Chuck is the Principal Market Growth Strategist, Cybersecurity and Emerging Technologies for General Dynamics Mission Systems. Chuck is also an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University in their Applied Intelligence program, and LinkedIn has named Chuck as one of the top 5 tech people to follow on LinkedIn out of the 550 million members that exist. In government, Chuck has served at DHS as the first legislative director of the Science and Technology Directorate of the Department of Homeland Security. He's also served as a top advisor to the late Senator Arlen Specter on Capitol Hill, covering security and technology issues on Capitol Hill. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining this call and making the time in your schedules to support this ever-growing challenge we're experiencing. All right, so I'm going to dig right in here to a couple questions. Just get right into the meat and potatoes here. The first question, I'll just ask the question and then kind of go around and ask folks on the call directly how they like to respond. In lieu of what's going on with Iran and some of the news reports that are coming out, how serious is this threat, and who do you think should be concerned? And Mark Kelton, I'll start with you, please, sir.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I don't have to tell everybody that's very serious given events of late. But when keep in mind sort of the larger strategic picture, that this comes after 40 years of confrontation dating back to 1979, and there's been peaks and valleys in terms of that confrontation, but it has been a confrontation. People aren't always aware of it, that there aren't always military forces in play, but this has been a effective Cold War for that period of time. So what we're seeing in the wake of the killing of Soleimani, who was a very bad man, and responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American military personnel and thousands worldwide, is a heightened period of tension where Iran has demonstrated lately a lack of willingness to engage directly with the United States with a military confrontation. It seems to be backing off, and that's a very good thing. But that doesn't mean the confrontation is going to go away. And cyber is an ideal element for them to use. It's cyber as an instrument of intelligence, either for espionage or for sabotage, is the poor man's weapon. Relatively weaker countries, relatively weaker adversaries can asymmetrically respond to a larger adversary by virtue of cyber attack. Iran has a long history of this with the United States, probably ranking only third behind China and Russia as a cyber threat. And it surely can be expected to turn to cyber as one of the best weapons it has at its disposal now to put pressure on the United States and to attack the main U.S. centers of gravity, which are, of course, its military strength and its economy. So that would, apply not only government targets, but private sector targets. So everybody has to be aware of that. And that the sort of things we could see and have seen in the past from the Iranians range from DDoS to personal information threat to intellectual property theft, espionage, of course, and other sabotage. And you can also, more esoterically, they could potentially use destructive malware, which would be raising the stakes quite a bit, or even cyber enablement of kinetic attacks in a warfighting mode. So they have the full range of options and capabilities. Beyond that, of course, and what we've seen in the past couple of days is a dissemination of propaganda via cyber means, which is information warfare, information influence operations have long been used by the Iranians against their adversaries, be it the United States or our allies. So we can expect more of that. The final risk area really is if they decide to attack critical infrastructure in the United States, which certainly they have the capacity to try to do, although one hopes that our defenses are good enough to mitigate against the more serious sort of threat they can pose in that area.
Sure. No, absolutely. And very, very fair points, Mark. And that's a good segue into, John Mullen, just from your bio alone, from the critical infrastructure viewpoint, what are some of the things that come to your mind as we go through this?
I think of the potential for an Iranian attack eventually. I think right now, just in the immediate aftermath of Soleimani's death, they're probably licking their wounds a bit and trying to figure out how we were able to so closely track his movements in Iraq. So if you look at their OPSEC challenges right now, before they take a real kinetic strike, kinetic in the sense of destructive malware attacks against U.S. infrastructure, computer systems, or those of our allies, they're probably going to want to check their sixes first and make sure their operational security and their tradecraft is a little more secure than it has been in the past. They want, I think at this point, getting back to Mark's point, I fully agree. They are not eager to take on the U.S. military, but they are looking for some credible deniability in the event of a cyber attack, and we go looking there for forensic evidence connecting them to it. So I think just based on history, going back to your specific question, Neal, I think of both the Shamoon attack on Saudi Aramco in 2012 as being something that we can look to as history there. That was a wiperware attack on systems that outed about 30,000 computers of Saudi Aramco. I also think of the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment in late 2014. In both cases, those computers were rendered inoperable, and in Sony Pictures Entertainment case, you weren't just looking at discontinuity of operations, you're looking at a huge CapEx cost to reconstitute your network. And they'll be very patient, I think, before they launch that, as I said, given recent challenges, their operational security posture, but be very careful with their tradecraft going forward.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely correct, and your expertise and background here definitely, and being strategic in how they're going to approach this, especially from a cyber perspective, I think you're spot on. So John, you and I were talking about as we were prepping for this, at some point, what can a CISO that's on this call, how can they get ready for this, and what do they need to do in order to prepare for these type of scenarios?
I think in general terms, what I would advise is look to history. Look what they did in 2012 against Saudi Aramco. Look what they did, as I mentioned, against Sony Pictures Entertainment in terms of North Koreans, who, by the way, do talk to the Iranians on issues like this. They do share notes. And in 2014, and dissect those and look for clues there. That's one general point. The other point I would make, however, is the Iranians are going to up their game. I don't think they want attribution. They're going to deny us that to the extent they possibly can. So I think the thing you look for here is looking at those attacks and dissecting them in retrospect. What didn't work? The typical solutions out there today of endpoint detection and response will typically miss a certain percentage of things out there. So you've got to up your game and look at prevention here and finding something that will prevent malware, zero-day attacks in particular, from launching in the first place.
And John Loew, what do you think?
Thanks, Neal. I think that organizations, especially the ones joining us today, need to really assess and continue to reassess their own defenses. I think anyone who assumes they're safe is not. I think it's a good idea to engage with third parties outside your own organization to do deep vulnerability testing, red team exercises, and we highly advocate a system of layered defenses. We provide a very important layer, but we're the last company to say that there's any one solution to everyone's problems and to all problems. So a layered defense, engaging new technologies and thinking outside the box are urgent. But I urge everybody to take a look at their own defenses and hire the best possible pen testers and red team companies that you can.
Great. No, I think that's a very fair point. And I looked at the list of registrants before this call, and it matches up very much with kind of the existing customer base of AppGuard. So just to highlight for the speakers on the phone, we've got many banks, many law firms, critical infrastructure, state and local government agencies on the call. And so, I'll turn it over to Chuck Brooks. And, Chuck, from a technical perspective, what are the glaring things that stick out to you that we'd be concerned about? Is there specifics coming to your knowledge?
Well, it's interesting. There's going to be a lot of freelance attacks too. In the last 48 hours, been a 3-time jump in the number of IP attacks traced to Iran. Not all of them are government sponsored, and probably a lot of them are just associated with the freelance people doing it. That was from Cloudfire. But I think what is changed in the last couple of years from our posture in the United States is that we've recognized that the private sector owns almost 85% of the critical infrastructure. So what is critical is the information sharing component between the private sector, particularly what you mentioned, the banks. It was mentioned the Shaman attack on Saudi Aramco, but also in 2012, there was an attack on several banks in the United States, but distributed denial attacks and also a dam. So it's not the first time the Iranians have hacked us, and even more recently, they've been thought to be associated with the SamSam ransomware attack in Atlanta. I think in terms of technical capability, you cannot underestimate the Iranian capability. A lot of the attacks they initiated back with when they captured the Lockheed Martin RQ-170 Sentinel with their military cyber force. But in the last decade, they've had a lot of resources given to them, $150 billion. They spent a good portion of that in both terrorism and military capability, but they also bolstered and bought a lot of expertise in their cyber, and they've cooperated, as John mentioned, with North Korea, probably also with China and others. And so they have a very extensive capability and technical capability they can do for. I think the real test, actually I just even thinking just 2 days ago, the Bahraini National Oil Company was infected with another data wiper thing called Dustman, is to look at what they're likely to do. And that's going to be these type of attacks against critical infrastructure. And we have to sort of be able to look at, it's more of an intelligence operation now. Have they infiltrated the networks already and they're ready to activate sleepers? Or are they going to just try remotely to try to do things? And I think because of our change in posture, as I mentioned from the very beginning in the last 10 years, now we have Cybercom for DoD and CISA, that critical infrastructure support agents for DHS. We've taken a lot of effort and time to try to build these layers that you mentioned earlier about around these critical infrastructure. But I think because we're such a threat-rich environment, and there's so much low-hanging fruit, particularly with healthcare and others, we can expect that we can't cover everything. So we have to look at, yes, they have the technical capabilities, and yes, they could do something, but we have to also be able to be in a position to retaliate, which we can now do.
Sure, absolutely. So, is there any specific attacks? A two-pointed question for you. Is there any specific attacks that Iranians are known for? I know you mentioned, and Mark mentioned also a DDoS attack. Is there any specific attacks? And then as far as their complexity of attack, compared to maybe Russia or China's attack mechanisms, what's that like?
Well, the problem here they are not as advanced, of course, as Russia, as China, just they don't have the resources and capabilities of those countries, but they have the shared access knowledge. A lot of this stuff is shared openly on the dark web and also clandestinely between these countries. So they have the capability. Distributed now of service attacks are not that difficult. But again, now they're more into, like, as I mentioned, the SamSam ransomware attack in Atlanta and others. They're looking at automating a lot of these type of capabilities. And they have some of the same capabilities that the Chinese now have. And so that is a real problem. So not only you have to know what the threat environment is out there, you have to be sort of fortified against it. So that's why the information sharing part is so important. So I cannot underestimate. I would assume they have all the capabilities necessary to do any kind of severe ICS attack with our APT-33 unit. And so, the only thing we can do is be aware of it.
Yeah, I think some of the most well-known Iranian attacks that I've done some research on are going to be the APT-33, 34, and 35. And then anything that ends with kitten in the second word of it is probably a known bad thing, yes. Ironically. Right. So we'll definitely appreciate that. And to your point, if you look, it's very easy to just do a quick Google search and see that between, the intellectual property hacking of universities, between hacking into the Sands Las Vegas, between taking control and accessing the Bowman Dam, to the various DDoS attacks in the financial sector, that even though they may be not the most sophisticated attacks, the Iranians do have capabilities that to bring back older attacks that maybe the EDR platforms have kind of, given up on looking at, because it's like, we're looking for the most cutting edge, most homegrown, coolest botnet thing, but now taking a simple attack that hasn't been used in 7 or 10 years and throwing it back into the wild can really disrupt the environment.
Yeah, I think your point that it doesn't necessarily have to be sophisticated is really a good one, because I say most companies are not that sophisticated in their defenses. So it doesn't necessarily take, if you're looking at going against the government, it's different. But as I said before, that most of the industry and commercial infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and there's varying degrees of preparedness there. And they've also demonstrated against, how they've been able to take a power plant out against Turkey, and also they had an attack against the British Parliament in 2017. So anything's possible with the Iranians.
Sure. And for the guests on the phones, just as a quick reminder here, as I'm writing the note down to myself, we're going to be sharing a best practice document with all the attendees shortly after the webinar. And so for folks looking to take notes, we'll make sure to get that out to you guys. Now, I want to shift back over to Mark. What steps do you think that at a high level or an overall viewpoint, companies and agencies should be looking at to protect themselves even more now or in the future? Mark, let's go back over to you for a second.
Okay, so this is a difficult question because there's so many uncertainties as with how these strategic situations are going to unfold. Because the Iranians, of course, as John said, they're going to shoot for deniability in their attacks. So, at least at this point, I think, if the strategic situation worsens and their situation worsens and they see themselves more a threat, the level of aggressiveness they're willing to display and the leg, so to speak, they're willing to show and being behind those attacks goes up correspondingly. But for most companies and agencies, right, so at this stage, we're in a near crisis situation, or the threat could emerge on them at any moment, given the situation we're in. So you're basically in a situation where prior planning has to be strong enough, and I can't stress that enough. Most plans disappear at the moment of contact, so exercising incident response plans and the like are critical. But so the first thing is, you might do, I got some of this from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, but is of course heightened awareness to let employees and personnel know that there is a threat and what they might be encountering, and ensure you have coverage. Your gaps in coverage are covered by personnel and technology, and that relevant threat intelligence is shared. That's a big thing. Sharing of threat intelligence is a huge challenge. It's a challenge from government to the private sector and within the private sector. Increased organizational vigilance, that, of course, in the cyber arena should be a given, that people are monitoring internal and external capabilities and looking for threats. I would also add to that, and I always add to this, insider threat, particularly if you're in critical government agencies or critical infrastructure organizations. That would include finance and others. Reporting processes. Make sure everybody understands what the reporting processes are. If something does happen, what are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to alert people? How are they supposed to record the event? You don't want people freezing at the critical moment and not being able to disseminate that information. And finally, exercising your response plans. It's, as I said, it might be late for that, but maybe it's never too late to make sure that to run an exercise and what's going to happen if there is an incident. How are people going to react? Make sure they fully understand the expectations of them. And that's particularly true of your cyber team, but it goes more broadly to other people dealing with information technology and your employees writ large.
Yep,
okay.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And yep. John Mullen, let me just shift over to you. What's the advice you'd be giving if you got a phone call from a CISO to be like, hey, John Mullen, what should I be doing that I'm not doing? What's your advice there?
I think the first one that Mark already hit on is review your incident response plan, and if you tested it recently. I'd also go back on the fundamental suppositions made in the formulation of that most recent incident response plan. What has changed since? Some of the information we've seen in the last few days would suggest changes may be made in terms of potential Iranian capabilities and what they're capable of. I think the other thing is look at supply chain. And what I mean by that is a connectivity and the history of Iranian operations in the past. I'm talking not just kinetic strikes, but some of the infrastructure they have in place. You're talking Quds Force, MOIS, and other Iranian services and state actors that would be behind major attacks against U.S. infrastructure and government, state, local, and others. Should things escalate? Typically, they feel comfortable operating in Gulf states, Pakistan, Argentina, Thailand, places like Turkey, Austria. Look at where they've worked in the past and see if you can make correlations between activity there and either your own infrastructure or supply chain members or suppliers you have in that area. The Iranians, right, as Chuck said, are pretty sophisticated, but they're going to look for help wherever they can get it. And if they have a leg up through access through technology or subsidiaries or others supplying U.S. corporations. They'll use it.
Right, right. Yeah, I think it goes back to whether it's physical or whether it's digital, it's basically if you see something, say something, right? It goes back to right back to the basics of if there's a surge of traffic or a surge of packets or your IP addresses are getting hit a lot by something, especially based on what's going on now in the world. It's like just raise your hand and kind of highlight it, or that weird email comes in that you've never seen before. So, John Loew, from an enterprise point of view, you've described these threats to enterprises as asymmetrical. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So earlier in the conversation, Mark Kelton referred to asymmetrical warfare, and typically the United States has found itself as the larger entity dealing with smaller entities and weaker enemies which defines actually asymmetry. But what I think the people on this call haven't really thought about is the asymmetry in the opposite direction, where for the first time in history, private corporations in the U.S. and other countries are actually doing war with nation states who have far more sophistication and assets than they do. So prior to the cyber age, banks and law firms didn't have to consider how are they going to do battle with countries like Iran directly. Now Iran can decide that some of the banks and airlines and infrastructure companies on this call are targets of opportunity that are softer and can cause mayhem. Everyone on this call needs to imagine themselves doing war directly with nation states like Iran. And I'll go back to something I heard in a prior presentation from John Mullen, who's also on the call, which is the perimeter is dead. We should all be assuming that the adversary is already inside your network. Detection and reporting is great, but in reality, most of the attacks that will be launched against large enterprises will be exploiting vulnerabilities in applications and turning those applications against the operating system. So if you have a fallback position, it's assume that the enemy is inside your network, assume that they're seeing what you're doing. In order to do damage, they're going to need to turn something on your enterprise against you. AppGuard actually prevents applications from being hijacked and turned against the operating system. That does not mean you should get rid of your firewall and don't get rid of your reporting system, but prevention is what we all need to aim for. And what I have heard from customers is an over-reliance in the past on detection and response, when we really wouldn't accept that as a way of being in any other part of our lives. In health, we seek prevention, and for the health of our organizations, we should be focused on prevention as well.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate that. So we've got a couple questions that have come in already. We're going to hold them. Just a reminder to folks, if you have additional questions, please feel free to send them in, and then we're going to hold about 10, 12 minutes towards the end of the call so that we can answer questions correctly. Chuck, I want to dig into you a little bit because of your technical background and ask a pointed question about what do you think that CISOs and other enterprise cyber folks, could do to audit their own resiliency. Like everyone on this phone call already has the plan in place. They've already got the incident response plan. They fundamentally believe, like we all do, that we're doing everything we're supposed to prevent stuff like this. Then something like Iran happens. What can they be doing to audit their own resiliency?
Well, one thing I think it's also not just a technical issue, but it's a policy issue. Unfortunately, with a lot of companies, CISOs don't have a seat at the table with the C-suite, and they should. I think it's changing, but not changing fast enough. I think that the executive team needs to realize that this threat not only threatens image, but it threatens the bottom line of a company. And in the past, they've relied more on the IT. So I think you need to really put the CISO at the forefront. The second thing is what John was just alluding to, is preventive, and you got to practice. You got to have to do routine vulnerability assessments. You got to look at what the new and evolving threats are, and you need to cooperate and share information with other peers and corporations, and continually refine your methods and capabilities internally. And so that primarily is involved, with detecting phishing, which is still the number one threat to most companies and the easiest way in. But it also is involved in basically what John is saying, is you've got to be able to know what's on your operating system, and you've got to be able to control it from an administrative point to make sure, because you're likely already compromised, and it's usually 6 to 8 months before you realize you're compromised. So if you go with the assumption that your system is already compromised, and you develop your preparedness and your plans around that, rather than looking about what would happen if I was hacked, assume you already are hacked. And then that's
Sure.
probably the best advice I can give a CISO.
No, and I think that's very valuable. We all need to, no matter what walk of our life we're going through, we always need that accountability partner, who's going to, dot the I's and cross the T's for us, or ask us to recheck our T's and I's and make sure that we're still holding up to that spreadsheet or framework that we built for a board meeting 6 or 8 months ago. So it's very, very helpful. For Mark Kelton or John Mullen, or for John Loew also. So this event happens, right? The U.S. uses a drone attack against Iran, and then there was a couple of missiles fired back in return. Then there's this plane incident that is still being understood who's the culprit in that, if there is a culprit in that. Do you think that this is just something that just goes away, or is Iran's response to this going to be an ongoing thing as a result of this? What do you guys think?
I think, this is John Mullen, I think it's an ongoing thing. I think it's evidence of that. The Iranian prime minister said, I think we're done, or something to that effect. Khamenei, the supreme leader, came out shortly after that, said, what you saw the other night with the missile attacks is a slap in the face to the U.S., but we're not done. We want meaningful revenge, emphasizing the word revenge. So I think this is deeply important to them. I think it was made clear in the press after Soleimani's death that this was the equivalent of the head of CIA, JSOC, and a national security advisor rolled into one person. He's also a personally close advisor to the supreme leader himself in Iran. So some experts in Iran deem him at the time the second most important person in their government. So that opens all kinds of possibilities against, the possibilities of Iranian retribution. I don't think, as Mark said at the outset, and I agree with, that they're eager to take on the U.S. military in a full kinetic confrontation at this point, but they're going to look for other things to exact revenge on the U.S. and our allies. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, and this is John Loew. I agree with what John Mullen said. Without getting into the merits of whether Soleimani should have been killed or not, I don't think the Iranians are done. I agree they don't want a kinetic fight on their hands with a far superior adversary, but I do think that they have the ability to be a persistent disruptor to us, and I believe that cyber is going to be their continued weapon of choice. Not only because it's less expensive, but particularly, as it was mentioned earlier, because they can do so and have the attack and deny attribution. And I think we're going to witness some of the terror organizations that Iran has funded in the past. We all know that Hezbollah has operations around the globe. I think that we can expect to see cyber attacks emanating from different parts of the world and having proxies claim responsibility. I think it's a convenient way for Iran to keep responding against us without incurring the direct military might of the United States and its allies.
So I'll weigh in a little bit. I'll weigh in a little bit. This is not done. The issue, of course, of the struggle between the United States and Iran, as I said earlier, goes back 40 years. The killing of Soleimani is just a one watershed in that fight. The larger issue, though, is the maximum pressure campaign, the economic sanctions being put on Iran, and those sanctions are really starting to bite. They have an internal problem inside Iran where people are expressing increasing dissatisfaction. That is not a dynamic that favors the Iranian regime. As the pressure increases on the regime, they will in turn lash out and seek to strike externally, seeking probably to avoid military confrontation at the outset, but trying to use other means. Cyber lends itself ideally to that, as we've discussed. So it's not over by any means.
Right. Right. No, completely agreed. And thank you all for your comments there on that specific question. If I'm going to be completely honest here, one thing that I think is super interesting in this example, and it's going to lead into our next question, is as this kind of evolved, this event evolved, we had several of AppGuard's existing partners within like the first 12, 16 hours of this event happening, the initial event, reach out to us and say, hey, I'm sure you've seen the news. This just happened. We're looking for some guidance and to leverage some of your subject matter experience. What are the best practices? And, I think it's an amazing thing that goes on in cybersecurity industry that doesn't go on in a lot of other industries, is that the vendors, have so much access and so much exposure to, again, speakers like Mark Kelton and John Mullen and Chuck Brooks, that we become this massive resource for our customers and for our clients and for our partners. And I think it becomes very important to be able to tap into those resources when stuff like this happens, because if you're at an enterprise or at a government agency, you're so busy trying to do your job every day that you may or may not have the time, effort, or resources to tap into what the vendors can get access to in a very short span of time, and may be able to add more value to your conversation and be able to move the needle forward for your group or your business or even for your client base in a way that delivers very valuable information. So with that said, Chuck, do you have any other additional resources or places that, you can suggest to people to go for support or effort on stuff like this?
Yeah, I mean, the first stop, I think, is DHS, particularly if you're in the civilian part of it. It's been restructured, and CISA has a lot of cooperative programs where they're also doing stuff. Also, the ISACs are very good. There's another organization I'm involved with called the Cybersecurity Collaborative, which is involved with CISO sharing information. And also, believe it or not, social media is a good route. On LinkedIn, there's a lot of interesting resources and groups and postings, and from all over the world, and a lot of discussion among cybersecurity experts pretty openly. So I think it's good. And then there's one other that I use often called Panelist, which is again another peer sharing information. But there is a lot of resources, and it's incumbent upon anyone in the cybersecurity world to sort of look into all of them and see what fits your needs.
Great. No, that's extremely helpful, Chuck. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to pivot here. I've got a couple more questions I would have liked to have gotten through, but I want to make sure that we answer the questions for the folks that sent some questions in. So for the first question is for our speakers, what countries are aligned with Iran, and should they consider blocking their firewalls to these type of countries? So I guess the question is, what countries align with Iran, and could possible attacks be coming from because they're supporters of that side?
Well, pardon me. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. So what countries align with Iran? Iran, of course, has relationships with the North Koreans, which we've seen, particularly their missiles, which are North Korean genesis, ties to Russia, China. The question of whether those countries will launch attacks in defense of Iran is another issue. I think what's important here is that there's been sharing of information, which I think John Mullen talked about earlier, sharing of information between those countries, and they will have the Iranians will have watched closely what those countries have done in attacking the United States in the cyber arena. And frankly, the Russians and the Chinese in particular have been extremely effective. Now, the Chinese, of course, launched a broader scale of attacks on our economic realm simply because their economy is larger and they consume more information on a broader scale, and they sweep it all up. The Iranians tend to be more targeted, but the lessons learned from that will have not have been lost on the Iranians. One other, the other question that we get frequently is, what about elections and the like, and information operations, influence operations, trying to change your public opinion? You can expect that will go on too. They've done it in the past. They will have absorbed the lessons of late of the effectiveness of those campaigns mounted by both the Russians and the Chinese, and will do the same thing in the future.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, follow on Mark's comments, just hitting that point. In terms of cybersecurity threats emanating from Iran in the aftermath of Soleimani's death, I think the people you need to be concerned about, as Mark said, are the Chinese, the Russians, and the North Koreans. Iran talks to them all. Now, without getting into the substance of what they talk about and what we know and don't know about that, I think logic would dictate that they will share targeting information. They will share some things on the margin with each other, not collectively, but one-on-one in terms of their own networks between them, those players. And they may, one country may help another over some technical hurdle to get something done. I do not think that would rise to the level of sharing zero-day tools or cooperation and development of those at that point. But the point is, the expertise of those countries, China and Russia in particular, more advanced than North Koreans, can't be ruled out as time goes by. I think both of those countries would like to see the U.S. leave the Middle East, which is Khamenei's stated goal, not just revenge against the U.S., but the extrication of the U.S. from that part of the world in general. And if that's in their means, they'll do their best, I think, to share what they think is appropriate in their interests without poking us too much directly in the eye in the process.
Yeah, makes complete sense. So, John Loew, I want to ask a pointed question to you. What do you think these events, or what impact could these events have on the upcoming elections?
Well, if you're referring to the elections here in the U.S. Later this year, I think we can look at areas around the world where there's significant unrest and instability, whether it's Ukraine or Hong Kong, Iraq, Lebanon, Venezuela, whether the U.S. is involved in some way, or whether we are or we are not. We're certainly blamed for being involved, and I think that many of our adversaries are looking forward to creating mayhem here in the U.S. As we lead into our election cycle. I know that it's in their crosshairs to either interfere with our election or delegitimize certain aspects of our election, calling into question the outcome, the validity of certain results. And I think we got a good taste of that in the last election. But I think that we're living in a little bit different world, and I think we're going to see a little bit more aggressive activity on the parts of our adversaries, and cyber is the way they're going to do it. And I'm very curious to hear what John, Mark, and Chuck think about the same subject.
Mark, John, or Chuck, do you have a comment on the impact on the elections?
Well, I think it's Chuck. I mean, it's definitely a target of not just of Iran, but like John said, many countries. I think the interesting thing here is that there was a lot of talk about attacks last time, but very little really happened. Russia got hold of a couple public databases, and no votes were changed. So I think there's been a lot of money and effort put into these elections. I think the real area, what John mentioned, is more the disinformation, the stuff that's really put out, and which the media picks up pretty readily, so they don't need to try very hard. So I think in terms of the security of the ballot, I think there's been a lot done. And of course, that's a state issue, not a federal issue for the most part. So it's very difficult with all these varied machines. But be sure that is anything to try to delegitimize outcomes in elections and confuse people are definitely what our adversaries are going to be up to.
Great, thanks for that, Chuck. John or Mark, any other comments?
Yeah, I think I agree with Chuck. I think that in my own mind, I make a distinction between the operations designed to, for example, compromise machines used in the voting process, which is a big enough concern and complex, as Chuck said, given the state and federal responsibilities there. But I think the thing that's more nefarious and harder to get at is disinformation put over, seemingly reputable channels, social media firms and others that target specific elements of the population. And people really don't realize, given their reading trends, what's real and what isn't. They kind of roped into their own little forum of news channels, and they're not going to see dissenting views or things that help them question some of the suppositions they've made based on information they are reading. So it's dangerous.
Got it.
So I
Mark?
agree. I agree with what's been said, but so it's always good to keep in mind that efforts to influence the United States are as old as the Republic. Democracies are always going to be at a disadvantage in that equation. The idea that we can hold out adverse information or keep it away from the populace it's impossible. We can't do that. So we're, at the end of the day, we do what we can, the U.S. government and private organizations, to identify information that is clearly disinformation or misinformation, which is rife today. But we depend upon the population writ large, for better or worse. Usually it's been for better, but this is not something that this kind of campaign is not something that's going to go away. The effectiveness has always been there, and what has changed over the years is, of course, the ability to actualize that information, to actually disseminate it quickly, that the internet and modern technology has provided.
Sure. No, absolutely. All right, so we've got a couple more minutes here. I want to make it through the last couple questions we have. I know we mentioned a couple by name, but Chuck, I'll shift over to you as another question came in. It says, what specific attacks, come to mind that Iranians have used in the past? And is there 3-4 specific types of attacks, names of those attacks that we could see a resurgence in?
Yeah, I think what has been the most common, which has been used on the banks, which is used on the dam and other things, has been the distributed denial of service attacks. They're relatively easy. I think what's happening next, you have to look what they're doing now with the wipers, the data wipers, the dustmen, and the early shaman. That seems to be their trend. So they're using that is a much more deadly and sophisticated way of removing information from PCs. So I think you're going to see more of that. It's pretty easier, and you can do that with malware planted inside a system, or you can do it from outside. So I think you're going to see more and more of that type of attack. And again, one other one is ransomware, which is now being shared among a lot of the bad guys. And as I said before, they already were involved with the SamSam ransomware attack in Atlanta. So I think they're going to do what's easiest, and that's, again, a question of plausible deniability, because it's very difficult to sort of pin who the original aggressor is on some of these attacks.
Great, thanks for that, Chuck. Really appreciate it. So I just want to be conscious of everyone's time here. Any final words? Let's go around the table once, and any final words or closing remarks to add. Let's start with you, Mark Kelton.
Well, people might ask, what don't we know about the threats that are out there? And there's a hell of a lot we don't know because the strategic situation is fluid. The thing I would stress is that the degree of Iranian aggressiveness that we're going to see is going to be in direct correlation to the threat that the regime perceives itself to be under. So we can expect right now they will use cyber, but probably try to be deniable. But the aggressiveness with which they will employ it will increase in direct correlation to the strategic situation, particularly if it worsens.
Sure. Thank you for that. John Mullen.
No, I agree with Mark. I think that the situation bears monitoring. I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of fireworks in terms of direct military to military confrontation. But I expect to see the Iranians up their game, both in terms of sophistication, as they kind of revisit OPSEC failures that they've experienced of late, and get better at this. Getting back to Chuck's point, though, I think they are not going to view U.S. targets in particular in the cyber realm as a monolithic instance here. They're going to differentiate between the state and locals that may not have the sophisticated defenses in place, or small and medium-sized enterprises, for that matter, with the international banks based in New York and others. They will differentiate, and they'll use what they think they can get away with. And if something looks criminal and not tied to greater geopolitical activities, and if it worked in the past, they'll use it again.
Yeah, sure. Chuck Brooks.
Yeah, no, I concur with John and Mark. I mean, I think it's going to be the low-hanging fruit that they're going to go after first, and what it all comes down to is risk management. And now I think that we've entered this new decade, a digital decade. Everything should be reevaluated, and companies and industries should be looking at how to improve and fortify their digital defenses.
John Loew.
AppGuard's been in the market in the private sector for only 2.5 years after a long history working in the U.S. intelligence community. The company began marketing to the private sector because it was becoming obvious that private sector companies were now being targeted by nation states at an increasing and alarming rate. So I encourage everybody on this call to look at themselves as their own country needing to do battle against other nation states, while at the same time taking advantage of the resources that the U.S. government can provide, and also what private companies can provide. AppGuard is used by global banks, law firms, airlines, insurance companies, and public entities. I encourage you to contact us to find out why. And we even have a tool that is cutting edge that will help identify risk on your enterprise and then have AppGuard prevent breaches in relation to those risks. So thanks for Neal and everybody on the call for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts, and I'm really appreciative of the time. On behalf of AppGuard, I want to thank Chuck Brooks, John Mullen, and Mark Kelton for their time and their dedication to making our country secure.
Thanks, John. Thank you, everybody, for attending this call, and we will be sending out a follow-up with a best practices document shortly, and we look forward to sharing that. And if anybody would like to leverage us for a knowledge base, we look forward to it. Have a great day.